Welcome to Design to Move, a weekly functional movement series reviewing common movement impairment syndromes, muscle imbalances, and injury cycles and how to correct for them. Don't just exercise, but restore optimal movement.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Design to Move. My name is Ryan Maxwell. This is Ryan Parr. We're two movement specialists here at Fluid Health and Fitness. And today we're going to talk to you about another movement distortion called asymmetrical weight shift or pelvic obliquity. This basically has to do with uneven hips, whether they tilt laterally or rotate more than they should. And usually this has to do with overactive muscles on one side of the body that complement another set of overactive muscles on the opposite hemisphere. And normally that occurs because we like to use one side over the other. Okay, so that creates those asymmetries, and unfortunately that can lead to extra torque or rotation around the pelvis, sacrum, spine, upper spine, trunk, etc. So we'll show you today how to use a handful of stretching protocols to rebalance the hips, use some strength exercises to ensure that they don't go back to that other position, and then reinforce it with some integrated movement that teaches your brain how to sustain the position for the long haul. If you have any questions on today's topic, feel free to reach out to us at admin@fluidhealthandfitness.com. Otherwise, we do welcome you to reach out for a virtual assessment so we can give you a biomechanical screen, show you where your distortion patterns are happening. So again, reach out to us at admin@fluidhealthandfitness for that. And we have a blog on the topic in the description below where we go into more detail. You can read more about that there. And as you notice, we do have a table of contents here to the side. This gives you timestamps of all the segments that we're going to go through today with a condensed version of the entire video at the bottom once you get familiar with this and you just need a reminder. On that note, let's get right into our topic, and we'll start off with stretching. So our first segment is on mobility and release. Here's how we're going to show you how to lengthen and extend the muscles that are typically overactive or tight in the body. Today we're going to target the adductors of your dominant leg and the abductors of your non-dominant, the ones that rotate the femur in and the ones that rotate the femur out. That's your mobility. Let's get started. The first stretch that we're going to get into is the groin muscles. These are the muscles that pull the leg internally into the middle of the body and internally rotate the femur. So they adduct the leg and they internally rotate it. Now when those are contracted, the muscles attach from the femur to the pubic bone and they have a tendency to pull the pelvis inward on the opposite hemisphere. And when that goes on, it has a tendency to hike the hip on the same hemisphere and drop the hip on the opposite. Now what that does, once again, is create too much rotation into the spine and can lead to issues with bulging discs, herniations, and again, convexity or even functional scoliosis with the spine. So what we want to do is reduce the pressure of these groin muscles by going into a static stretch. This is going to be a PNF stretch or a neuromuscular stretch. And he's going to do that, Ryan's going to show you how to do that from a kneeling position with his leg abducted out to the side. So a couple things to think about is supporting the torso so that the spinal column and the pelvis doesn't rotate too excessively. We want to know that the leg can come out away from the body without too much rotation externally on the opposite hemisphere, okay, or externally on the same hemisphere, internally on the opposite hemisphere. Ryan's also going to make sure that he keeps his knee nice and locked so that it doesn't buckle. This puts him into a position where the femur wants to rotate in and the tibia will maybe want to rotate out, and that can create a lot of lateral pressure on that kneecap, so we want to protect that. So as Ryan goes into the stretch, he can lean forward over his palms, bringing his pelvis forward, ascending his pelvis, and he can get a deeper stretch on the front or short adductor fibers or groin fibers. And then as he sits back into his heel, he can start to get into the back fibers. Now what we can do to help with the elongation of the stretch or the extension of the muscle is push down into the ground, flexing the groin muscles like you're trying to bring your leg into the middle of your body. Hold it there for about 3 to 5 seconds, then relax it, and then see if you can extend the leg out further or abduct the leg out further away from the middle of the body. You can do that for about 6 to 10 cycles where you push down. I like to breathe out to pull the pelvis under, give it a nice stable anchor point to flex that muscle from, and then breathe in, sink forward, and then push the leg out and away. Now remember, the orientation of the pelvis in relationship to that femur is going to dictate what sets of muscles you're going to stretch. Oftentimes the tight side has tighter short fibers, and again, not so tight back fibers or long fibers. So either way, we want to know that we can get the leg away from the body into abduction about 40 degrees or 30 degrees without any additional rotation of the pelvis. So use that as your landmark to determine what side, or in determining how far out you're moving that leg. Now that we've done the groin muscles, and Ryan, you can come out, we're going to go into the abductor or external rotators on the opposite hemisphere. So what we know is that if the muscles are tight on the groin and we get an internal sweep of the pelvis on the opposite hemisphere, the muscles on that femur, on that opposite hemisphere, have a tendency to be tight on the external rotators, or again, the glute max, the deeper 5 external rotators, and the piriformis. So in order to stretch that, we have to do the opposite action of posterior tilt and, again, external rotation, which would be, again, anterior tilt, flexion, and adduction of that leg. So Ryan's going to do that by getting into all fours. He's going to pull his left leg across the midline of the body so that the kneecap is just adjacent to his sternum, and his toes are going to be internally rotated. So he's going to allow the tibia to rotate inward by pulling the foot inward. Now from there, he's going to extend his right arm in front of him, bring it out and towards the middle of the body. So he's going to create, again, some lateral pressure there. And then he's going to pull his left arm out and away. Now, if he doesn't have that balance point, he can always put his hand off to the side. But the goal here is to keep the shoulder in retraction on the left side. Now, the goal, once again, is to exert some medial pressure in the opposite hip. So his right hip should be pulled down towards the ground so that he can get the sacrum back and around and get a nice deep stretch from the lateral rotators on his left hemisphere. If he notices that his knee starts to buckle or his foot starts to kick inward like so, or his hip starts to rotate up, or his back starts to, again, round, this is a good indication that the muscle's too tight and he's gone too far into that stretch. So he's going to try his best to keep his back in extension. He's going to try to keep his right hemisphere close to the ground, and he's going to hold that position, then breathe out, push down into the knee, flexing the muscle to, again, instigate this PNF stretch, get a neuromuscular relax, and then breathe in and sink down into the hip, going deeper into flexion and internal rotation through the femur. So what you can do is, as you sink and you breathe in, rotate the knee inward on the left, flex the groin on the left, and place the hip deeper into flexion by sitting the butt backwards. He can use his opposite right palm to assist with the pressure, create some external force through his shoulder flexion, and then go through multiple iterations of that PNF protocol by flexing the muscle, holding it under tension, let it relax, breathe in, and sink back into a deeper stretch. And there it is. So very simply put, oftentimes the muscles that internally rotate the femur on a dominant side will pull the pelvis inward on the opposite hemisphere and pull it under. That action places the muscles on the opposite hemisphere into a state of contraction that extend the hip and rotate the femur out. So what we'd like to do is reestablish the natural symmetries by reducing the groin or the adductors on the dominant and the abductor external on the non-dominant. And that should get your hips back to a neutral alignment and an upright mid-stance phase where both feet are on the ground. You won't see one hip shifting forward over the other. And again, you would normally see the opposite hip of the dominant side rotated forward if you saw that relationship. So make sure to be aware of that. If you're having a hard time, again, reach out to us if you can't see it yourself. But we'll help you to identify that, and then we can give you the right sequence of stretches to get your body back to balance. There it is. Our second segment is activation. Here's where we show you how to target specifically the muscles that are normally not recruited or are weak because they've been stretched. Today, we're going to do the exact opposite of what we did for mobility by targeting the abductor external rotators of the dominant leg while working the adductors or internal rotators of the non-dominant leg. Let's get into it. In keeping with the restoring of the pelvic alignment, we're going to work on the abductors of the dominant side. So we just stretched out Ryan's groin muscles on his right leg. Now we want to target the muscles that do the opposite of what the groin does. That's again, extending the hip and externally rotating the femur. Okay, so muscles that help with that are the glute maximus, glute med in men partially, and again, the piriformis and the deep external rotators. We also want to think about the muscles that help to pull it back behind the body, like the hamstrings. They all kind of work in concert with each other. So in order to do that, Ryan's getting into a side lying position. He's on his left side with his right leg up. He's going to stack his weight so that his head, ribs, and shoulders, again, are all on the same plane and lined up with his pelvis. He's going to extend his right leg away from the body, so he's straightening the knee and pulling the toe up towards the shin. And he's going to kick his leg back into extension while maintaining a neutral level pelvic alignment. Now, if we have tight TFL muscles, like a lot of us do, if we do have this internally rotated femur position, you may not be able to get the femur past the hip line without accessory motion in the pelvis going back and forth like so, or helping with your QL deeper extensor muscles on that side hiking up, especially on the side that's dominant, because your body likes to go into anterior drop in the pelvis, so you have a tendency to overuse the QL or back extensors. So we want to protect for that. So make sure that again, as you kick your leg back, you don't move through the hip. The hip bone right here, the ASIS, should not move. It should stay in line with the ASIS on the left hemisphere, so no outward sweeping. That's very important. Once you get a general sense of what that looks like, you're going to bring your leg into flexion with the knee straight, the foot flat to the floor. Bring it up as far as you can without hyperextension or flexion in the lower back, and then bring it back behind you, getting the femur, or trying to keep the femur in line with the trochanter or hip bone here so it doesn't go further. Then again, the ability for you to support the pelvis through your abdominals. So he's breathing in as he kicks his leg forward, keeping the foot in line with the floor, and then breathing out and kicking the leg back. Now, a couple things we want to focus on. Breathing mechanics as you bring the leg forward, breathing in. It's helping you to extend through the spine as you stretch through the hamstrings. And then as you kick the leg backward into extension, breathing out, flexing the abdominals to help with the stretch of the quadricep, TFL, and again, the knee flexors. So we're going to do this for about 2 sets of 20 repetitions. You're going to give yourself a minute in between each set. You want to do a nice slow controlled arc. And again, one more pointer, make sure that as you kick the foot through, you don't see too much external rotation. We don't want to see a ton of that. We don't want to see the pelvis rotate out. We want to keep the pelvis nice and neutral and really target the muscles around the proximal attachments of the femur, glute maximus, glute med in men, some of the piriformis, and again, these medial hamstrings behind you. So good job, Ryan. We would only do that on the dominant side, and then we would go into an activation of the other side of the body, the groin. So while we have Ryan in this position, we can actually get right into it. So the left side had a tendency to be externally rotated, meaning the femur was rotated outward, where you would see the knee go into varus, meaning away from the body, inside out. So what we want to do is do the exact opposite of that. We want to pull the leg into internal rotation by rotating the femur upward, and then bring it in again to flexion and extension. So Ryan's getting his hips into a neutral position. He wants to make sure that his hip doesn't rotate forward too much or backward too much. He's locking his knee out on that left knee. He's keeping his foot flat to the ground and then rotating internally so that the kneecap actually goes towards the ceiling. So he's going to try to keep it there, and he's going to kick his leg forward and then kick it back. So if there's extra tension in those external rotators as he kicks forward, they're going to want to stretch out. His hip's going to want to rotate in the opposite direction. And once again, our goal here is to keep it neutral. So if we know that the left hip likes to rotate in too much as he kicks backwards, it has a tendency to want to rotate his pelvis excessively. So we want to make sure that we keep the pelvis nice and neutral. By again, practicing the same breathing mechanics. Breathe out as the leg gets kicked back. Breathe in as you pull it forward into flexion. And once again, try to keep your hip bones in line with each other. Ryan's doing that. He's doing a really good job of doing that. And if you guys can see that from this angle, he's not letting his hips move around too much and his back's nice and straight. So that's good, Ryan. So one more time, we would do 2 sets of 20 repetitions on both sides of the body. One with the abductors on the right side, if that was your dominant, and then a set on the adductors on the left side, if that was your regressive or your non-dominant, and that will take you through activation. Our third segment is integration. Here's where we teach the mind and muscle connection. What we're trying to do is reestablish a motor program that coordinates the movement of the ankle, knee, and hip in a synchronized way that protects the joints and allows us to create clean and efficient movement. Today, for unequal or asymmetrical hip, you are going to target this through a single leg hip press while trying to maintain the equilibrium of the hips. Let's get into it. So for activation, we're going to go into a single leg hip press. What this is going to do is coordinate the engagement of the hamstrings, glutes, but also the muscles that support the lumbopelvic hip system, muscles around the pelvis and the lower spine. So to get into a position where this can be really effective, we're going to start here on the right side, and Ryan's going to put his left arm down on the ground. We're going to go into what's called the posterior oblique sling system by engaging the contralateral or the opposite hemisphere's lat, that's the left side, while pushing through the right hip and lifting the pelvis off. Now, as Ryan does that, he's going to pull his opposite leg into flexion, like you would see during walking or gait or ambulation, and he's going to push down through his heel and lift his pelvis up. Now, in a position or a pelvic position where the hip is too dominant on the externals because the groin might be too tight, what you might see is the knee rotate away and the hip drop down like this. That means that, again, we have so much tension from the groin on that dominant side that it makes the externals over-engage when it goes back into extension. The leg goes back to extension. So the goal here is to provide sufficient force through the lat to maintain the extension of the opposite hemisphere so that we can engage the flexors against gravity to keep that pelvis neutral by keeping it pulled inward, but not too inward, and keep the femur tracking at its natural Q angle, or again, inclination towards the inside of the body at about 13 degrees from the out to in. Now he's going to push down and let the body come down. And he's going to try his best here not to let the pelvis rotate down on the left hemisphere. He's going to do that by keeping his knee subtly internally rotated, but not too much. He's going to keep his knee away, but not too much. Press through the hip. Push down on the left hemisphere. If you notice, both of his left and right hip bones are nice and neutral. By engaging the lat, keeps his back nice and straight. His hip flexor is not going to be so strong. His groin isn't going to be so strong on the left that it pulls his hip over. And then that way that femur can track nice and evenly in that socket that has the tabulum. So he's going to breathe in, push up. Keep the knee inside the hip line. Keep both the right and left hip bones parallel to the ground, and then breathe out and come down nice and slow. A couple pointers. As you do this, breathing in, look down towards your hips. As you push down, push away almost through your heel, almost like you're pushing your foot down, almost like you're going back into extension. Now, if we switch out to the left side, we'll start talking about the opposite hemisphere. And we know that this guy has a tendency, if this was the regressive or externally rotated, to want to rotate open. So as he pushes up, that hip is going to start to rotate down excessively on the opposite hemisphere. As he pushes, you'll see that hip again rotate inward because the glutes are tight and pulling the whole pelvis with it. So we're not going to let that happen. So the goal, once again, is to keep the knee internally rotated, keep the opposite palm on the ground, initiate through the lat on that right side by pushing down, keep the hip nice and neutral by keeping this leg out subtly, push down through the heel on the left side, keep the hip line nice and neutral. So he might want to, again, just pull this over just a little bit. There we go, right? And then come down nice and controlled with no excessive external rotation in that femur. So don't let the femur rotate out at the top or at the bottom. Again, he's going to initiate through the lat on the right side, engage his glute, push up and through, make sure his hip line is nice and neutral. Now, one is too high up or down. He's going to keep that left knee in just a little bit and then come down nice and slow to a count of 4. Very good, right? So that's how we would go into integrate. Remember, our goal here is to learn how to stabilize the opposite floating pelvis by engaging the flexors and the groin and the extensors to hold that pelvis neutral against the posterior lateral pressure that's coming through with the glutes and making sure that the medial groin can support it all at the same time. It's a mouthful and a lot to think about, the more that you practice it, the better you're going to get at it. So once again, do 2 sets of 20 repetitions on both hemispheres. If you have questions on the details of the mechanics or you want someone to watch you and keep you through it, once again, reach out to us at admin@fluidhealthfitness.com. Final segment is strength. Here's where we're going to overload and fatigue the muscles responsible for cementing this position into our body's movement patterns. Today we want to work on the muscles that are responsible for holding the pelvis neutral, the transverse abdominis. So on that note, let's get right to it. So our final movement is a laying supine dead bug. So this is a colloquial term for basically engaging the transverse abdominis, which is the deepest, most abdominal muscle. And it basically serves as a girdle around your pelvis and your ribs. And it allows us to hold our pelvis stable as we move our legs through the acetabular socket in the pelvis. So if there's not enough functional strength or stiffness in these muscles, then the pelvis moves around more than it should, and we get that asymmetry potential because of which. So now that we've reduced the relationships, the tugging and the pulling relationships on the hips, we want to see if we can get our hips to move, or our legs to move evenly in the acetabular socket without additional displacement of the pelvis. So to do that, what we're going to do is get into a prone position, or excuse me, a supine position. Ryan's going to get set up in a neutral alignment, so he's going to tuck his chin, keep his back in line together, so his lower back is going to be on the ground. And he's bringing his legs up to 90, so he's flexed through his hips and his knees are just inside of his hip line so that they're just slightly inside the acetabular socket. Now, independently, he's going to bring one leg down into extension at a time, and then concurrently, he's going to bring the opposite arm away on the opposite side of the torso. Okay, he's going to stretch out through the lat on his left arm, as you see here, and the flexors on his right leg, and then bring the appendages back into a neutral alignment. A couple things to think about as we do this. We're going to breathe out to contract the abdominals, to help to resist the stretch of the hip flexors and the pec and the lat on the opposite arm. And then breathe in as we come up, using the weight of our arms to again engage our abdominals as we breathe in against our diaphragm. So we're trying to teach optimal zone of that position so that the abs and the diaphragm work together. So again, he's going to breathe out, slowly letting the air out from his lungs, extending the leg down to the floor, flexing the shoulder overhead, making note to try to keep the scapula in line with his ribs as he draws the arm overhead, and then bring the arm back up. So what he's going to do again is go about 20 repetitions, total of 10 on both sides. As he lengthens the leg down, he's going to make note that his pelvis does not move. So his hips should not start to tilt down on the leg that is being extended, nor should it rotate outward. If that's going on, there's a good indication that the TFL, outer lateral hip flexor muscle, is getting too tight or is too tight. Again, and that then shows up as extra rotation through the pelvis and leads to those asymmetries that we're trying to reduce. So make note of that. Make sure that your lower back stays in contact with the ground or slightly off that. If you get really good at holding this position, you can start to go into more extension in the spine as the leg comes down, as it would naturally show up during gait. But you want to be careful of that you don't hyperextend as the leg comes through. One more time, if you notice that the legs are too open as they're up in flexion, like so. So if you had them open like that, or again, one starts to rotate to one side over the other, you're going to notice again, pelvis starts to move around. Dominant side, obviously, is going to have some tension with those abductors, going to rotate the pelvis around, so we don't want to see that. Make sure you contain the range of motion through the hip extension flexion until you're able to keep it completely neutral or not let the hip rotate at all. So again, 2 sets of 20 repetitions, give yourself a minute in between, and that would bring you to the end of the strength set. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Design to Move. Remember, this one was on asymmetrical hip shift or pelvic obliquity. This has to do with uneven pelvic alignment where one hip will hike up and it'll create a curve into the spine and alter the positioning of the rib cage and by extension the shoulders and the neck. So this is a global issue, and it's important that we establish and maintain equilibrium of not only the lateral position or horizontal position, but how it rotates. Today we hope to do that by establishing better recruitment patterns of the internal and external rotators of the femurs to help offset those obliquities, and then teach you how to stabilize the pelvis more efficiently once those relationships are more in check with the way that you're intended to move. If you have questions on what we went over today, we would love to hear from you. Remember, this can be pretty complicated, so we do want to give you some personal guidance. If you want to do a free virtual assessment where we give you a biomechanical screening, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us at admin@fluidhealthandfitness.com. One of our movement specialists would reach out and touch base with you right away. Or you can read the blog on the topic to get more information on it. It's listed in the description below, so make sure to take a look at that. Once again, we always say your body is designed to move, so stay in motion. So join us again for another episode of Design to Move, and we'll see you next time.